Hey guys, Doug here from Motion. Today I am plumbing the wastegates on my 72 Nova, and I thought to myself, what better way to explain how to do it than to just show you while I do it on my own personal car. We get this question a lot. We've posted diagrams, but we figured we would just kind of give you a step-by-step, show you the pieces involved in it. So let's go ahead and just get started. On my personal setup, we're just using a dual Mac valve style setup. One solenoid is going to act as an increase and one's going to act as a decrease. This is a really common setup. They have a billet version now. I'm not sure it's worth the extra money. I honestly don't know if the ECUs even operate fast enough to use the additional speed that the new ones react at, but these work just fine. These solenoids are about 45 bucks a piece, and we make this cool little mounting bracket here that comes with a T. And that way you can kind of pull all this together and just mount it with two simple bolts, because it's really difficult to mount off those bolts originally. And then we're going to be working with some precision wastegates. I've already had these on the car. They work great. This is a Turbosmart one, but the one thing that all external wastegates have in common is they have a bottom port, and that is going to be for pushing the diaphragm up, in turn basically opening the valve. And then they have one on top, which is going to be for pushing on a diaphragm, which is closing the valve against the seat. So if you're not familiar with a wastegate, just a high-level overview, the exhaust comes in, as you can see from the headers, into the bottom of the wastegate where the valve is right here. Obviously, if you're trying to make more boost, you're trying to hold that valve shut, so you're going to apply CO2 on the top and hold that valve against the bottom. There's a seat that goes in here, so it'll all seal up just like a cylinder head will. When you're trying to bleed boost off or control boost, you're going to take the pressure off the top of this, and the boost pressure from the turbo, which you obviously already have because you're trying to get rid of boost, will push the diaphragm up and turn, opening the valve. And as you can see, that will allow the exhaust gas to bypass from the bottom here through here and then out a exhaust dump. And as you can see on my particular combo, I ran the exhaust dump out the side of the car right next to the regular downpipe. As I mentioned, the bottom port actually gets hooked right to the turbos. If you look on these turbos, there's a port on these precision turbos, and I already went ahead and put a push to connect fitting in it. And this is basically positive boost pressure. So this is going to be what helps you open the valve when you're trying to get rid of boost. On a CO2 setup, you're not worried about what that is, because you can always overcome it with the CO2 you're putting on top. So on any setup, you definitely want to make sure you have that line hooked up, because for instance, this one, we threw this car together in a hurry, and I actually just left those disconnected when we went to drag week the first year. And when we finally got the car to run, it makes like 28, 30 PSI of boost instantly. When there's no pressure trying to push the valve up, this engine combo is so efficient, you literally cannot control the boost. It just goes right to the top. So you need something for when, you know, your boost controller is trying to control things down. It needs to have a positive pressure able to push up on it, because your boost controller is going to apply pressure here. Even if it bleeds to zero, if everything's pinned closed, it's just not going to open. So that is an important line to hook up. You will see that from time to time, somebody that's running, say, like a class like Ultra Street or X275, they will either plug or leave this piece open, because basically those guys are trying to build boost as fast as they possibly can, and they might use a different strategy to control power off the line. And they're basically just trying to slam that gate shut as fast as they can and have no force working against it. I think maybe some pulling tractors and stuff like that also. Also, on really big combos, you'll actually see people do some different things with, they'll put like a Mac valve in line with this. So they will control it opening and closing so that they can basically kind of trick it into building boost real quick, and then they'll use the Mac valve to open and allow it to have pressure so they can bleed it off if they need to. So they basically just close it off so it's not helping them, and then they'll open it up so it's working again. So just a little bit of insight. That's not going to be applicable for most people, especially if this is your first CO2 setup. So make sure you hook up those ports to the bottom part of the wastegate. You can always, if yours doesn't have those ports, you can always drill and tap the cover. The other option is to hook up, you know, somewhere in the intake manifold, though I will note, if you slam the throttle blade closed, there's going to be no pressure behind here, so you would want it to be in the piping up here to be perfect and more efficient. So just something to consider when you're building your own project. Now the top portion of the wastegate, like I said, these are the same whether it's a Turbosmart or JGS or Precision or Tial, whatever. We'll have a port, and like I said, that is the pressure that's pushing down on the diaphragm. The diaphragm is connected directly to the shaft that's moving the valve. And so all we're trying to do here with CO2 is put a certain amount of CO2, and then that will hold the valve closed. So if you're trying to make 20 pounds of boost, theoretically, if you have a well-designed system, 20-ish pounds of CO2 or manifold or positive air pressure will make 20 pounds of boost plus the spring. So if you have 3 or 4 pounds of spring, you're gonna make 23, 24 pounds. So, but it will vary up and down depending on what the combo is, how efficient, how big the wastegates are in comparison. But generally speaking, we're trying to put CO2 in here, and what your solenoids will actually do is, like I said earlier, you have an increased solenoid and a decrease. So we're gonna put a sensor right here, which will measure this. You can also put the sensor actually right on the wastegate. And so it's gonna see CO2 pressure coming from our CO2 bottle and regulator, which is usually set 60 to 100 PSI, just depending on preference of the tuner and yourself and the boost controller. So it's gonna see 60 to 100 PSI here, and it's the sensor that's reading what the actual pressure is right here is gonna go into the computer, the ECU or the boost controller, and it's gonna say, okay, we need to add 10 pounds of CO2 pressure because we're only at 10. So it's gonna open this valve and the air is gonna come out this port right here. If this pressure gets too high, this decreased solenoid is gonna open, and all that pressure built up in this area here is gonna release out here, which is just an exhaust. So it's constantly changing. If you hear a dual solenoid setup on one of these, it's always opening and closing, opening and closing, opening and closing. Now there's a thing called open loop boost control and closed loop boost control. So open loop boost control is simply we're monitoring how much pressure is on the top of the wastegate. So like I said before, different changes can actually dynamically change how much 20 PSI means to the actual boost of the car. You add timing, you subtract timing, that type of thing. Recently, I think AMS NLR Systems was the first one to come out with closed loop boost. And what it does is it takes your actual manifold air pressure and it takes your top port on your wastegate dome and it compares the two. So it's like in your boost controller, you're shooting for 20 PSI. It's actually gonna actively up and down your increase and decrease solenoid to try and hit that target boost level, not CO2 dome pressure level. So definitely make sure you understand if you're setting up an open loop boost control or a closed loop boost control. While it won't matter on how you plumb it, it's definitely gonna matter on your strategy, but that's more of a tuning topic we can talk about later. One of the things I stress about CO2 boost control is the fittings. If you've seen the little cheap plastic fittings, they tend to get brittle and break or leak. Even some of the metal fittings are not very good. We've spent years basically trying to find a repeatable, nice fitting that seals on both ends, doesn't leak, and still swivels. And these fittings are amazing. We switched to these a number of years back, and they actually have a nylon seal right here, so you don't have to actually Teflon tape them. They'll work in a straight thread or an NPT thread. So we have 1/8 inch, quarter, 3/8 in these style fittings, and they seal up amazing, which means a bottle of CO2 can actually last a long, long, long time. And of course, the other component is a quality line. One of the mistakes I see a lot of people make is they'll just grab whatever push to connect line they can find. And there's not tons of difference, but the thermal properties make a huge difference. The cheap stuff that you'll find a lot of places doesn't hold up well to heat. I mean, just the ambient heat of the engine will just literally melt this stuff right apart. And so somebody will come with a new build and have issues, and I'm like, let's look at your line. A lot of times it's melted, or this is leaking. A good indication of fittings or line leaking, if you have the car on or off and turn the boost controller on and open your CO2 bottle, you can actually hear the solenoids pulsating. That means that there's a leak in the system because it's trying to add and subtract CO2 quickly to make up for it. And with an active leak, it's never going to maintain. So when you turn your boost controller on and you have CO2, it should, make a quick buzz sound or clicking sound and get to a boost or CO2 pressure and then stay there. It shouldn't be constantly pulsating. If it's pulsating, number one indication you have a leak, and it's probably from some crap fitting. So definitely consider, if you're doing it from scratch, buying some nice fittings. I'm really partial to ours. We don't make them, but we've sourced a fitting we can trust and we know doesn't leak, and people have great success with them. And they're super low profile with that nylon style seal. So because this is a twin turbo setup and mine have actual fittings, I'm actually going to just run a line from each turbo to the actual bottom port of the wastegate. Now you can actually tee, if you have a single turbo, you can tee these lines. As you can see, if you had like just one turbo, you could take it off the turbo and tee it and go to the bottom port of both of these wastegates. It's not a big deal, but in the interest of the fact that we actually have ports that we need, we can go ahead and just run this line directly to where we need to go, and that's good enough. So what I do is I just go ahead and kind of mock it up. One thing you want to consider, even though this is high temp style line, is just making sure that your line is not touching the hot side. This should be good enough because it's far enough away. You know, I usually say, you know, probably 3 or 4 fingers worth of distance from a hot side is good enough, especially on something that's actually rated for it. But sometimes you might miss it and sometimes you won't. I actually picked up these PEX style plumbing cutters from Menards. It's made to cut that nylon PEX stuff. And that's another important part to not having a leaking fitting. It just clamps right down on there and creates a nice flush cut, so there's no edges, no pieces hanging out. A lot of times that's what will make a fitting leak, is the fact that it doesn't have a nice sealed surface to go in there. So basically what I'll do is I'll just zip tie this over here, and that'll keep everything away from the heat source where it's actually gonna melt or cause issues. Another quick note, just like any fuel line, as you're handling this stuff and it's been sitting around your shop and our shop and warehouses and all that stuff, make sure that once you cut your piece, you use some air and blow it out. There can be little pieces, probably not the most important for the actual wastegate, but if that stuff gets into solenoids and sensors, it can definitely damage, cause things to hang open and not work properly. Now some people actually hardline these lines right here, and that's super cool looking. I never do because I end up changing and working on stuff a lot, and I'm sure there's a lot of quality hard lines and stuff, but it definitely adds the complexity of A, the build, and B, maintenancing. You know, if you've ever bent hard lines, sometimes if you only have like one angle on them or something, they get really tight to put on and off. And then I'm also afraid of them cracking, which also may not be an issue. It's just something that I found this Nylock stuff to work really well. It's really easy to handle, and I don't really worry about cracking and stuff, because when you're chasing down a boost leak or something being bad, that's just not something I really want to deal with, is making sure the fittings and the seals on the actual hard line and stuff are all good to go. Basically every time I bend up brake lines, I have a leak, so I just think about that in my head and I'm like, I don't want to chase boost leaks around. So my personal preference is to do Nylock. That doesn't, or nylon push to connect. It doesn't mean anybody else is wrong doing hardline. Okay, so one of the nice things is I've already decided I didn't like the line routing of that. So I, with this nylon, you can actually reuse them and you don't have to retape them every 2 seconds. So if it wasn't nylon, you would have to mock it up, take it back apart, or tape it every time. So that's kind of a pain. All right, so we'll make a new line. This will route a little bit better. It seemed like that one, when it went to there, it was kind of running into stuff. So now we can just kind of run this out and around and straight into here. Okay, so bottom ports are all plumbed on this setup. Like I said, if you have a single turbo, just tee the line coming from the turbo or the piping and go to each one, no big deal. Next thing we're gonna do is plumb the top ports to the actual solenoids. Like I said before, we have an in, which is always gonna be your #1 solenoid, #1 port on your first solenoid. You see we can't use that on the other one. So that's gonna be your CO2 in from your bottle and your regulator. This port right here is gonna go to the top of your wastegate or the dome. So whether you have one wastegate or two, you're gonna use the same solenoid setup. The only difference is after it comes out of here, if you have two wastegates, you're gonna tee it and run one branch of the tee to each wastegate. If you just have one wastegate, you're gonna run it right from here to the wastegate. This setup I built for my Nova, I built it around being functional and being able to work on the road because we take it on drag week. And it just laid out in a manner that the wastegates are pretty close to the hood. So typically what I would do is put the actual dome pressure sensor, which is measuring the CO2 or manifold pressure or compressed air at the actual dome right there. Because I don't have room for that, this fitting is actually, on this side, is actually close to the hood. It doesn't touch, but it's close. I can't put that there. But normally there's a lot of different wastegates and a lot of different styles. If the fitting's there and you need 2 ports, aka one for the actual pressure and one for the sensor, you would take one of these brass tees. I suggest the brass tees. They're stronger than the steel ones. The steel ones you'll find, or aluminum I guess, will crack and you'll just eventually find it in pieces and you'll be all out of CO2 and you'll be unhappy and you'll lose the race. So use a brass tee. We sell them. You can get them a number of different places. This one has proven to be really reliable and strong. But you would screw that right into that port and you would have a sensor here and a CO2 line there. So it's basically going to measure, and obviously this line that's going in here would be teed to the 2. So you can actually just measure pressure right off of one of the 2 wastegates. And if you really wanted to get fancy, you could measure both just so you have a knowledge of where they're both at. But again, no boost controller is actually going to control individual wastegates, or at least not most of them on the market will not. So I went ahead and created a mount for this solenoid system down here near my headlight. You'll notice it's very close in proximity to the wastegates. If you have a sensor and solenoids, they actually do respond. You can see a pretty big change as you start to lengthen their distance from where they're reacting. You can really see this on like a activated solenoid or activated pneumatic arm. If you move the solenoids away from the arm, like on our CO2 parachute release, every few inches, you can actually see how much less pressure it has. It's just very less impactful. So keeping these close to the actual wastegates will make it more fast acting and more effective as far as I'm concerned. If fast is what you want this line right here to be as short as possible. So because I don't have room on the actual wastegates, I'm actually going to screw one of these brass tees in right here, and I'll monitor the pressure right here at the actual solenoids, and then I'll tee after that and go forward to the wastegates, or backwards to the wastegates. Okay, so one last note. I'll put this diagram in the description below in the comments, or I guess the description area. You can check it out. You want to make sure these 2 ports are plugged. They're number 3 on both of the MAC valve solenoids. This one doesn't actually have to have an elbow on it, but because it's the exhaust for the decreased solenoid. So basically when it's trying to bleed off, it opens and then just vents this to atmosphere. But one thing you want to consider is if you have a straight shot into the solenoid, being in an engine bay or somewhere where debris can get up in, a piece of debris can actually get lodged in there, which you don't want. So I just do this because there's a really low chance of something getting up and taking and turning a corner there. I got my solenoids mounted and my line coming from that middle block, which is coming off the brass block. If you had your sensor mounted on a wastegate, you would just come off that center port between the 2 MAC valves or whatever you're using. And then we're gonna go, basically what I'm gonna do is put a T in right about down here, and then I can shoot one branch across over to here and then one up to finish this row here. So I'll go ahead and do that now. So now we got our T in line, and then we're gonna run right up to here. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and run this last line here. One thing you definitely want to consider is leaving yourself some extra length if it's something, or at least buying a bunch of this extra line. That way if you get in a pickle, you can, say something is routed wrong and you're at the track for the first time. It allows you to, fix things and not have to start from scratch. So this is the other style of solenoid. You can see it just has 2 small, what they call a bullet valve in it, and then a manifold block. Now Holley, Fuel Tech, and I think Haltech and a number of companies have these now. They're really expensive. I think the Haltech one's a lot less expensive than the Holley. I'm not sure why it's so expensive, but you can see the general idea. It's got an inlet this would be your number 1 port, what I was showing you on the other Mac valves. This is the center port, which is that fitting that ties the two together. And then you have an exhaust right here, which has no threads because it's just simply an exhaust. So same concept, all built into one. You'll see a lot of those out there as well. I'm just as fine using the Mac valve, the 2 of those tied together, as I am this thing. It saves you about 150 bucks. Hey guys, so I really wanted to show you how the insides of a wastegate work. If you've never taken one apart, that makes a lot more sense once you see the internals and how things work. So as I mentioned before, you have a valve on the bottom. When that opens, I took the springs out of this one. You can see it'll let hot gas bypass. That hot gas is obviously what's driving the turbine side of your turbo. So when that bypasses that, it's essentially trying to take it away from being a turbocharged motor to just letting things bypass. It's obviously going to have some turbine speed, but not much. When you take this apart, there's actually springs inside of it. But as you can see, that valve on the bottom, when I push, I'll hold this diaphragm in here, but that valve is basically directly connected to this diaphragm. And so you can see this thing move up and down. You know, when we put air on the bottom port here, it goes below the diaphragm, which is essentially pushing the diaphragm or the whole mechanism upward. Now this is going to be the same on a JGS wastegate where it actually has a piston involved. It's just a piston with O-rings instead of a diaphragm. So put air on the bottom side, it allows that to open. So you can imagine if you don't have any pressure on the bottom side and you're trying to bleed off you know, boost or pressure going into the turbine side, it's not going to be very effective. So having that hooked up is essential to having a good boost control setup, especially on something where you're not trying to make max boost all the time. Now, wastegates come preloaded with springs, and they typically come with a variety of spring packages. This is what was in this wastegate, and these aren't exact numbers, but they give you readouts when you buy a wastegate. So this might be like a 3-pound spring, and this is a 4-pound spring. And when you put them together, they're say 6 or 7 pounds. They give you a little chart that tells you what springs to make what poundage. So in a CO2 application, we will typically run the smallest spring possible. So, the reason why we do that is because you don't need the spring to hold the valve closed. If you were running a turbocharged setup and you were just running manifold pressure or just running on what they call wastegate spring, all the boost you're going to make is what this spring makes. If you hook up manifold pressure with a boost controller, you can make roughly double of this. So on a CO2 setup, I'll usually say there's usually like a 2, 3, 4 pound spring. Put that in there, and the reason why is because all we're trying to do is put a spring in here so that it actually will close the valve back shut and have some tension on it. If we start adding a 7, 8, 10 pound spring, every PSI of CO2 is going to be additional to that. So it's hard to regulate really low, and obviously all the stuff on top would be added on there. So like I said, with a non-CO2 controlled setup, all you're going to have for boost, max boost is going to be what this spring is capable of. And then if you add manifold pressure, you can roughly double it. So let's say we have a 3-pound spring, we add manifold pressure, and we can now make 6 pounds roughly. But with CO2, you can literally go from what the smallest spring is, so 3 pounds, all the way up to 200-300 PSI. Of course, your sensor that reads will have to go that high for it to, all make sense. But that's important on a setup, call an import or a engine with 2 huge wastegates or a humongous turbo that's hard to spool. A lot of those guys will actually apply like massive amounts of pressure on top of the wastegate dome. They might put 200-300 PSI, and it's basically trying to overcome the force of the engine so that they can really keep that thing clamped shut when the forces are working on it, so that they can spool that humongous turbo in relation to the engine faster. So that's a little bit more of an advanced thing, but as you can see, the hole here on the top of the wastegate is going to add pressure into this compartment, and the wastegate itself seals that up. So when you add pressure to the top, you're essentially pushing the valve back down into the seat down here. When you add it to the bottom, it's pushing it up. So you can imagine the kind of seesaw effect as you're Wastegate is trying to reach a certain CO2 level or a boost level in a closed loop situation. So that's the inside of a wastegate. It's relatively simple. As I mentioned, you'll see a diaphragm set up like this on the Precision or Tial or Turbosmart. JGS is another company that we carry. They have a piston, and I'm pretty fond of their wastegates. The piston design is awesome. The only issue with a diaphragm is that, you know, imperfections in the rubber or large amounts of CO2 can actually rupture or tear the diaphragm. And of course, then you have no boost and no control. And I've seen it several times, and you know, it's not a fun situation if you're at the track racing and you're on to the next round or whatever. So the piston is super reliable, super effective, and even on the highest horsepower radial cars, we've switched a few of them over to that piston design recently, and they're really effective. But for your everyday person, even the Nova we just showed you, you know, making 1,500 to 2,000 horsepower, this style of diaphragm wastegate works just fine also. We're all done here. I hope it all makes a lot of sense to you now. As I had mentioned before, I'm going to put the diagram in the description on how you plumb this. Just remember, if you have two wastegates, you just tee the line it would normally go to one wastegate. As you'll see in the diagram, that's made for just one wastegate. If you guys are interested in adding CO2 to a project that you have or are building, we have a really nice kit. We have one for a single wastegate and one for a dual wastegate. Gives you all the lines, fittings, bottle regulator, comes with an optional roll cage mount, and basically you can have all the stuff we just used here. You can easily install it in one night after work or on a weekend. If you have any questions beyond that, we're always here to help and happy to give you some direction and some assistance and advice. Sales@motionraceworks.com is a good way to contact us, and then our 800 number I'll put below. So thanks for tuning in, guys. Hope this was helpful, and we will see you next time.